Greetings everyone and welcome to another Masterclass brought to you by Hexachords. This is Composition 2. Now there's a couple things I want to say before I really dive into this. First of all, I was questioning at the beginning of doing these Masterclasses what really qualifies me as a master to be giving Masterclasses. And I kind of gave up on that thought because it really doesn't matter. I'm not here as some sort of master myself, so much as trying to teach you to master things yourself. So I tried to think of it in the terms of how can I convey what knowledge I do have to you, to impart that wisdom to you so that you can take something away from these lessons. Rather than to think of myself as a master, I'm thinking it more of a class for you to master. And that was kind of a turning point in my brain. Another thing I wanted to get across is that these classes are not designed for general composition techniques, although that is one of the features and highlights that I am going to be talking about, but mostly going to be designed around mastering Orb Composer and how to get the most out of that. But we are going to be discussing other concepts as well, so these videos might get quite long as we continue through the series. So there's a few concepts that we discussed last time, and you can go watch the video up there somewhere. And it's the masterclass that I did, the first one, and you can see that we talked about getting rhythms, motifs, and establishing patterns. In this episode, I want to discuss two new concepts: control and ear training. And we'll talk about ear training first. So ear training essentially is taking a piece of music that you like, perhaps, and trying to recreate it in some way. Whether that be just on piano, or if you actually want to go through and load up all your virtual instruments and try to do it that way. But I'm going to load up just an example that I've done in the ear training department recently. Now, I am going to be giving you all an assignment, so be prepared. But this particular example is from the Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So that was the minecart chase from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and I transcribed it by ear using the original from Spotify, which you can actually go listen to on Spotify and compare the two if you'd like. Now, is it a perfect transcription? Absolutely not. There's some mistakes for sure, but I did try to get as close as I could, and also tried to mock it up with my virtual instruments as close as I could. So it was kind of a exercise for me to do that. And this is something that I would recommend all of you go out and do if you have the ability to do so. Now, you don't have to have all these virtual instruments that I used. You can just transcribe it on piano or on synthesizer or whatever you want to transcribe it on. It doesn't really matter. As long as you're transcribing something that's actually going to teach you better ear training and actually going to give you better ideas. So when you do ear training, when you do transcriptions, you're actually learning what that composer did in order to achieve a certain result. And so you listen to something you like, and maybe you're not sure how they did it. And ideally, you would have a score to compare to. I don't think the score for this exists anywhere. If it does, it's probably locked away in a room somewhere being examined by top men. But nevertheless, the point here is that you need to learn to master the ability to hear something and kind of know what they're doing, what the composer is doing. And that will give you more control, which is we're going to go to that next, over your own ability to compose. So let's talk about control. There are several ways we can describe control. One is control over your own ability as a composer, the ability to listen and hear things and have ideas. But the other one is having control over your tools, having control over your DAW, your virtual instruments, your hardware, whether that be a keyboard or whatever you have, and also having control over any other software you might be using, for example, Orb Composer, as you can see on the screen here. So being able to master your tools is being in control of your tools is just as important as being in control of your ear and being able to hear things and know when something does and doesn't work. Now, I'm going to be giving you all an assignment. Down in the description below, there's a link to a video. Now, the first half of the video is all that you need to work on. But here's the assignment. I want all of you to do your best ability to transcribe the first version of the Galaxy Quest theme and send it to me as an audio file. It can be on piano only, or it can be realized with virtual instruments. The choice is yours. But send it to me at benjamin.masonet@hexachords.com, and I will give you feedback on how you did with the transcription. Now, this idea didn't originate with me, but I would like you guys to do this because I think it will be a good exercise, and the Galaxy Quest theme is a relatively easy one to kind of hear what's going on, and it's a good sort of starter for someone who wants to learn transcription. After that, of course, I want you to go out on your own and pick pieces that you like, that you want to transcribe, something that you've heard before, something that you have fallen in love with, and you're just like, God, how did they do that? Play it, figure it out, and learn how they did it. That's the best way you can learn. And that's the best way you're going to master composition in general. So this episode is really about those two things, ear training and control. So let's dive into Orb Composer and try to take control of this track that we were working on last time. So let's just recap what we have here in this track and how it progresses and what we're going to do next. So that's where we landed on this track the last time we were working on it. Now, there's a couple things I'd like to go back and fix, and we'll talk about those as well. But one of the things I want to discuss is what comes next. What in your mind comes next after this? Is it just a bigger version of the same thing? Maybe. The track is 1 minute and 4 seconds long at this point. At this moment in time, we can see here, the track is 1 minute and 4 seconds. In my opinion, and it's not always true, but in my opinion, around the 1 minute mark is when you should introduce something new, some sort of new concept or new idea that builds on the previous idea. How can we do that in Orb Composer? So now what we're going to do is bring in another theme block, and we're going to use a chord progression I've already created, because we're not going to stick to the chord progression it gives us. So what I'm going to do is copy over this motif to the new theme, and I'm going to let that sit, and I'm going to also copy the chords and the bass so that everything has the same rough pattern that we had before, except now we're going to change chord progressions. Now, to change the chord progression here, we're in F major. The one I want to have is melancholy. I want to go from this uplifting vibe that we had before, where we were in D, with the nice D, B flat, F major, C major. I want to go down to melancholy. So to do that, we just go F major. This one's F. The melancholy one starts on the second note of the chord, which is G in this case. So we're just going to pull in melancholy 2. And we're just going to drag and drop these chord progressions. Now, if you're curious where I'm getting these chord progressions, again, description, you can find a link to the starter chord progressions. That's all I'm using, and the reason I'm doing that is because it's just simple, and we can just kind of graft onto that quite easily. So let's listen to what Orb Composer has created using these chord progressions and the new ideas that we've come up with here. So let's give that a listen. That's okay. I think the one thing I'm going to take away there is the B flat major 7. I'm going to replace that with melancholy 1 and try that F major instead and see how that comes across. So let's try that. So that works pretty well. Now the problem here is that the bass is actually playing way too high in the octave. We want to go ahead and bring that down to the second octave below C, below middle C. So we'll go ahead and take a listen to that now. Cool. So let's listen to that in context with the previous block. Okay, now as you can see, the pattern kind of feels the same, but we've changed our harmonic structure, which means we have not vertical development, but horizontal development. And that's what we talked about last time, is how are we going to achieve horizontal development? Now this is what we do. We change our chord progression, perhaps. We can also change our melody, which we did. The melody is different now, but I do want to actually make it a little bit louder than everything else because it's not quite sticking out. So we're going to just kind of bring up the intensity of the melody just a little bit. But the one thing I can say here is that I think the transition works quite well, and the reason it works so well, the reason it works very simply, is because the last chord of the previous bar is a 5 of the previous of the key. So F major, the 5 is C major, which means we can go pretty much anywhere we want to from there. There's virtually no limit to how we can go from a 5. We can go to a 1, we can go to something else, we can go to anything we want to pretty much, as long as we make it work in context. And that the context is really what drives what happens. Now, the reason why a lot of these chord progressions that are on that list below in the description, the reason why they work so well together and you can kind of shimmy between them is because most of them end on the 5 or the 4. The dominant 5 is how you transition between these harmonized chords. The chord progressions is because that 5 chord is dominant, and it allows you to move to something else very simply and very easily, seamlessly. And so what we have here, just starting off at the beginning again, we will listen to the whole thing in context with everything that we have so far. I think that works really well, and it can be something we can build on. And you'll note that we haven't added any instruments. We haven't, made this big orchestration. We have simply piano, and that's it. We're just using our piano. And we're not really going crazy here with these ideas. We're just sort of, building on a simple concept, and that simple concept is that opening motif. Now, that motif is naked at the opening, which I do want to change. This is something I wanted to change before, and it's not. We can have a naked motif. That's fine. I probably should use a different word, but it's going to get demonetized. But we're not monetizing it anyway. But I want to add some different chords, and I also want to. But I want it to be subtle, and I want it to be nice and kind of chill. So 13 Destiny is actually pretty good. I'm going to make it 2 Polyphony and bring it to octave 0. And let's listen to how that sounds, and we're going to go ahead and bring the intensity down as well, just a little bit below the, so the melody is, the motif is what kind of sticks out there. So this is just a supporting role. So you can see how that nice, slow supporting role actually fits really well with the motif. It actually comes in on that nice beat where it makes sense to have a chord. And that solidifies that motif a little bit more into the listener's head as well. So these ideas that I'm presenting to you, they're not novel, they're not new. They're just a way for you to take away something, hopefully, and get something out of Orb Composer that maybe you didn't know before. And by increasing your ability as a composer by doing the assignment down in the description, You will find that indeed you can actually get away with a lot of things, provided you understand the context of those things and how they work together and how they don't work together. Certain things just don't work, and some things do. But you can make pretty much any idea work if you can understand the context and you have control over what you're doing. So in this episode, we covered really 3 topics, even though we opened up with just talking about 2. One of them is ear training, transcribing music, picking music that you like and turning it into your own, transcription that you're doing and trying to mimic it as closely as possible. That's number 1. Number 2, control. Control over your instruments, control over your hardware, control over your software, control over your own ability as a composer, which requires training. I would stay away from music theory. If you're a new composer, don't worry too much about music theory. Music theory is not really something you need to be too concerned with until you get deeper into composing. Compose first, theory later. And finally, the last thing we talked about was horizontal development and how we can achieve that in Orb Composer very simply by taking a motif idea and keeping it throughout the piece. So that is our driver. That motif idea that we've created at the beginning, that is the heartbeat of this piece for the most part. And we keep that going throughout the piece, but the only thing that we're changing towards the last block is the chord progression, which also changes. We have a different melody as well, but it sticks to the same basic idea as the previous blocks, but just gives us something new to latch onto. And so because we've gotten so used to this motif and this melody at this point, that now we can move on to something new and explore new ideas with these same motifs, these same ideas, and not lose our listeners, not lose our audience. And I really want to stress that. You don't want to lose your audience. The moment that you go too far afield of the opening idea that you had, if you lose it, if you drop certain things from your piece, for example, let's say that motif wasn't in there, and we just had chords going at a different pace. Let's say they were a little bit higher density. We're just going to do this as an example. This is what happens when we create, let's say, an arpeggio instead of the motif that we had before. And we'll do 3 chord notes. So let's listen to how that transition sounds now. So it's not that can't work. That could work. But I think, and my opinion, is that that's too many changes at once. What I would do next is copy this block and then do something like a motivic change where we change the melody or the motif to something more like an arpeggio. That is the time to make that sort of change once we've gotten used to this new harmonic change and we're not changing too much at once. The human mind can only take so much. We're trained to we're just hardwired to only accept so much change at a time. And so changing too many things at once will lose your audience. So that's what I'm talking about there, is just being careful not to lose your audience and being careful with how much you change at once. Usually you can change 2 things at a time and not lose your audience. That's kind of the rule. It's not really a rule, but it's kind of the rule. You can change 2 things. That means either add 2 things, reharmonize 2 things, whatever it is that you're changing, 2 things most. And then you can change more things in the next section, etc. So let's go over more of that in Composition 3, because there's some more I want to talk about, especially with orchestration as well. But that is the end of Composition 2, and I really hope that you got something out of this video. We will talk more about composition in Composition 3. Look forward to that, and I will see you in the next one.
Hopefully you found this tutorial helpful. If you did, give us a like, and if you want to get your copy of Orb Composer, click the Buy Now button on the screen. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos.